Good afternoon, everybody. If you'd like to take your seats, I'd like to welcome you here today. On behalf of the Berkley Center, my name is Robert Vanderweg. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow and a professorial lecturer in the Department of Theology. And our panel today is titled Operationalizing Use Postbellum, Issues for Practitioners. And it's a privilege to be here today. And today we'll join our conversation that we started this morning with our two previous panels. And we have a wonderful group here today. Now let me introduce today's panelists. First, David Crocker is Senior Research Scholar at the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy and the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Professor Crocker was named Outstanding Faculty Member this past May by the University of Maryland, and he has served as a visiting professor at the University of Munich, twice a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Costa Rica, held the UNESCO Chair in Development at the University of Valencia in Spain, and taught in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Chile. Among his many publications are The Ethics of Global Development, Agency, Capability, and Deliberative Democracy by Cambridge University Press. He is in the midst of writing another book whose working title is Reckoning the Past Wrongs, Ends, Means, and Cases. His presentation today is called Use Postbellum in Civil War, Experiences from the Americas. Welcome, Professor Crocker. Albert Pierce is the first director of the Institute for National Security Ethics and Leadership, established in the fall of 2007 at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Pierce previously served as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics, now known as the Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, and as a professor of military strategy at the National War College. Prior to joining the War College faculty, Dr. Pierce was a defense correspondent for NBC News. Before that, he was deputy director of the Strategic Concepts Development Center and an in-house think tank established by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. Among his publications are The Armed Forces Officer, Ethics and the Future of Conflict, and Strategy, Ethics, and the War on Terrorism. His presentation today is called The Just War Tradition in Protracted Conflicts. Welcome, Professor Pierce. Brian Oren is the Director of International Studies and Global Engagement and a professor of philosophy at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He received his PhD from Columbia University, and his books include On War, A Dialogue, The Morality of War, Human Rights, Concept and Context, Michael Walzer on War and Justice, and War and International Justice, A Kantian Perspective. Currently, Professor Oren is writing an introduction to international studies for Oxford University Press, as well as a book on happiness. He is best known for his work on Use Postbellum, arguing for an inclusion of human rights into post-war reconstruction plans. His presentation today is called Justice After War Toward a New Geneva Convention. Welcome, Professor Oren. Finally, Jean Bethke Elshane is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and she is the Levy Chair in the Foundations of American Freedom here at Georgetown. Among her many books are Democracy on Trial, Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World, and her Gifford Lectures published in 2008 called Sovereignty, God, State, and Self. Professor Elshane is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellow, a holder of the McGuire Chair in Ethics at the Library of Congress, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and she currently serves as co-chair of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Her many outstanding accomplishments are only matched by her delightful graciousness, and we are honored to have her here at Georgetown. Her presentation is called Use Postbellum and an Ethic of Responsibility. Welcome, Professor Elshane. Like I mentioned, each speaker will have a total of 15 minutes. And at the 13-minute mark, I will just announce that there are 2 minutes remaining. And Professor Crocker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at Georgetown. I resisted the temptation to say something about not only Georgetown basketball, but Maryland basketball. Next year, we'll meet in the final, all right? In a very interesting book by a former colleague of mine, Jay Winik, April 1865, he makes the following comment. Most civil wars end quite badly, and history is rife with lessons that of how wars end is every bit as crucial as why they start and how they are waged. And later on, he concludes by saying, the conclusion of wars are every bit as crucial as why they begin and why they are fought. History is littered with the wreckage of bad endings. When Eric invited me to be part of this, I was reading Winik's book, and it was a jolt to me because I had been working for many years on what we call transitional justice, or reckoning with past wrongs in especially autocracies or dictatorships as they're making the transition to a more democratic society. The book was a jolt to me because I had been arguing for many years that punishment, or at least some form of sanction and accountability, was one of the principles that any society making this kind of transition should take very seriously, along with truth, platform for victims, reparation, reconciliation, and building a better society for the future. In reading Winik's book, it became clear to me that what I had been arguing before with the importance of a kind of democratic deliberation and decision on how to weigh and select these various norms, if it was applied to the United States at the conclusion of the Civil War, would force me to admit that there are times and places in which not only prudence but ethical responsibility and leadership require a kind of reconciliation, not as thick a kind of reconciliation as Desmond Tutu argued for in South Africa, but a kind of reconciliation that would bring some sort of healing to a nation that had lost, in this case, 620,000 soldiers, combatants, over a ghastly 4 years. What I want to do today is to reflect on the American experience in relation, to some extent, to experience that we see in Chile, in Argentina, in other countries in Latin America, of reckoning with past wrongs in the movement from a dictatorship like that of Pinochet to a fragile democracy, with Pinochet still behind the scenes at first, and to compare some of the lessons that we learned from Latin America with another country in the Americas, Nuestra America, and that is the United States. And what I want to focus on, and it may have some overlap with Professor Elstein's concept of responsibility, is the importance of leadership, both political and military leadership, as well as institutions. The topic of my most recent book has the word agency in. Another translation would be self-determination, autonomy, people being authors of their own lives and being responsible for their actions in spite of the fact that they're often hemmed in and constrained by many institutional factors. I think the enormous achievement of April 1865, and here following Winik's account, is unlike many rebellions over the generations and over the centuries that resulted in a bloodbath when the rebels were put down. In the case of the United States, there was a healing that took place, by and large, non-punishment, although Jefferson Davis spent some time in jail. Lincoln hoped that he would kind of disappear and get out of the way. And I think we have some lessons to learn about the combination of good leadership and good institutions and policies. some caveats. I'm drawing particularly on Jay Winik's book. I'm also stopping short of the deeply flawed experience of Reconstruction and following only the first few days and first few weeks after Appomattox. Let's look first at Lee and then at Grant. And preface this with a very important meeting between Abraham Lincoln near Richmond, taking the River Queen boat down from D.C. to Richmond, meeting with Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, anticipating the end of the war and saying to both of them, let them up easy. Those words would be important, I think, for Robert E. Lee, for Grant, for Sherman. Lee was faced, as he was surrounded by Union forces near Appomattox Courthouse, had gone through several bloody days of fighting after having been chased by Grant, and had the decision of whether to continue fighting, whether to surrender, or whether to give the word to his troops and to the generals that were in charge of other troops to head to the hills and become a guerrilla dispersed movement. He rejected both continued fighting because he saw how bloody it would be and how useless it would be, but he also rejected the guerrilla option. He accepted Grant's terms, he didn't know what they were going to be, as generous terms, ones that enabled the officers and unofficially other soldiers to return with their horses for planting in the coming season. He made it clear in his communications that he was now going to devote his whole effort to pacify the country and finally bring the people back to the Union. Grant likewise approached Appomattox Courthouse with a kind of magnanimity, with mild surrender terms, handing over guns, except for handguns, as I said about the horses. He treated Lee with respect. And in an important moment, both said goodbye to each other, tipping their hats. Grant also stopped Union jubilation when the word got out that the surrender had taken place. And he tried to curb the sentiments of hate that existed in his own troops, as Lee did a couple of days later when he said to his troops, "Go home now, and if you can, make as good citizens as you have good soldiers. You will do well, and I shall always be proud of you." And in a general order, number 9, which for many, many years was still read in the South, he doesn't advocate continuing the struggle as he might have, and he doesn't challenge the legitimacy of the Union. But of course, this is a long and arduous process that was not just at Appomattox. The formal surrender of Lee's army went against a good bit of tradition. Each side saluted the other side. Each side kneeled and each side finally prayed. But then the question was, would the spirit of Appomattox spread to the rest of the Confederacy. There were many other armies, especially Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina, other guerrilla bands, John Mosby's, Nathan Bedford. Many of the guerrillas could be on the run. What was interesting is that in time after time, there was a kind of contagion, and the Lee and Grant mode of interaction was repeated, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less success. There was a kind of discretion, a kind of leeway for an exercise of moral responsibility. In this case, a moral responsibility that would not include retributive justice, which, in my experience in Latin America, can and should play an important role with people like Pinochet being put in the dock. Unfortunately, he didn't live quite long enough to go through with anything more than indictments. But we also have to say something about policy and about institutions. And one of the tragedies of the ending of the war was, of course, the assassination only a few days after Appomattox of Abraham Lincoln. He had a view of not of occupying the South, but of enabling each of the southern states with only 10% of the vote to rejoin the Union. And of course, he was opposed by radical Republicans who wanted to completely occupy and take over the South. He was also opposed by conservatives who wanted basically to keep Dixie the way it was, only without slaves. We could talk about the earlier Emancipation Proclamation, about the 13th Amendment. But what's important is to recognize that for Lincoln, and then setting the principle that there should be no war trials, no hangings, no firing squads. And what I want to stress here is not just the big picture of leaders and of policies, but also the small acts that were important to bring about something called reconciliation. One policy that also has to be mentioned here that I think opens up the economic opportunities that were very important to Lincoln throughout his political life. The idea that with the Land Grant Moral Act passed in 1862, with the Homestead Act, America was in some sense on the move, and that opportunity would be available now to everyone. But I close with an anecdote about Robert E. Lee. In Richmond, which had of course been almost totally burned, only 2 hours by car from here. After the surrender, after Robert E. Lee came back to Richmond, his own plantation was destroyed. He attended the Episcopal Church that he had attended off and on for many years. And that particular Sunday, there was a communion. And the tradition in the church was first to have the white folks do communion, and then to have the black folks do communion. And the white folks were up at the rail, kneeling down, ready to partake. And out of the audience came a black man and kneeled at the altar. And the priest, the Episcopal priest, froze, as did everyone in the congregation. not knowing what to do. This had completely violated the Southern customs and traditions. And then out of the audience ambled a man somewhat bent over with thinning white hair and kneeled next to him. That was Robert E. Lee. Those small acts, as well as the larger policies, enabled the United States, after a terrible war, to reckon with the evil of the war and to move on with the idea that now we are together again as citizens, planting our fields and preparing for a United States of America instead of a North and South. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Crocker. And now, Professor Pierce.
Thank you very much. I want to thank and commend the organizers. You've done a terrific job, especially Eric Patterson, pulling all this together. I had earlier, by email, apologized to Eric for not turning in a draft of my paper early, and then a later note from him made me realize I'm not the only one on the panel who didn't turn it in. So there's, I'm reveling in the company I have here of delinquents. That's right. I also want to thank Eric for putting at least me on the last panel, because a lot of the points I was going to make have been made already by brilliant people this morning. So if you get a sense of deja vu, it's because you have heard a lot of this, seen and heard a lot of this over again. I proposed to Eric that I talk about just war tradition and protracted conflict. And I've organized my remarks in three parts. First, I'll just lay out a basic argument. And then second, curiously enough, in a conference that has to do with use postbellum, I'll talk about the decision to go to war. And then third, I'll talk a little bit about the conduct of war. First, the basic argument. Jim Johnson this morning expressed his skepticism about the concept use postbellum, and I probably even go beyond his skepticism. Jim and I over lunch reminded me that I always used to refer to him as Cardinal Jim Johnson. It's the first time I've had a chance to do it in a Catholic institution. So, Your Eminence, I'm delighted to have you here again. I have a problem with the post part of use postbellum. Most of the postbellum literature that I've read argues that when the war is over, we put aside the in bello principles because the fighting is finished. And then we pick up the postbellum principles, and they guide our conduct. Iraq and Afghanistan tells me it doesn't always work that way. So my remarks are predicated on my reading of two contemporary conflicts. One is now 8.5 years old, and the other is 7 years old. And I don't know about you, but when I listen to Professor Crocker talk about the end of the Civil War, and then you think about Iraq and Afghanistan, doesn't it break your heart? After all this time. The fact is, at least as I see it, is that we are doing on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan much, maybe most, of what the postbellum authors talk about while we're still in the in bello. We're doing stabilization, reconstruction, and nation building while there are people trying to kill us and we're trying to kill them. And so I had 2 years of Latin in high school and 1 semester of logic in college, and I can't figure out how we can be in the in and the post phases at the same time. So if we're still in the in bello phase, we shouldn't think that only when that's over do we have to start thinking about stabilization, reconstruction, nation building, because we're doing them simultaneously. So for me, thinking much of this activity as postbellum means it comes way too late for it to be helpful in the larger process. I'm reminded at the same time of a line from Clausewitz, who said, "In war, no decision is final." Let's not remember that just because someone says we're in the postbellum, everybody's going to agree we're in the postbellum. My basic approach is what I'm going to do next will be to integrate into ad bellum and in bello decisions, analyses, and calculations, much of what the postbellum authors talk about, because I think it needs more attention back then. It gets back to the point that Bob Royal made, quoting Eliot, "In my beginning is my end, and in my end is my beginning." So I want to make a two-part argument. First, that certain key ad bellum analyses, Certain odd bellum analyses, calculations, and decisions should be made in light of what people write about, much of what people write about the postbellum. And second, that certain in bello analyses, calculations, and decisions should be made in light of those same concepts that have come to be linked, or lumped rather, under postbellum. For both, in both parts that follow, I'm going to try to weave together considerations of strategy and considerations of ethics, which is a larger theme for me. I can't stand toe-to-toe with Jim Johnson or George Lucas in quoting philosophers, because I am not now and never have been one. But strategy is more my domain. I've thought for a long time that strategy and ethics have two different vocabularies, two different grammars, and two different logics. But more often than not, they actually point in the same direction. And if you enter into the vocabularies, the grammars, and the logics, they actually reinforce each other and reach similar conclusions. I taught strategy for 13 and a half years at National War College and have worked on it for the last dozen years. One way I used to teach students to think about strategy, military strategy, and particularly grand strategy, is to ask the question, what do you want the world to look like, or this certain part of the world to look like, after the war is over? In Clausewitzian terms, that drives you to think about the political objective. And Clausewitz says the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. For Clausewitz, the political objectives defines and forms everything else that follows. So if you think about either Afghanistan or Iraq, you can think of each of them in terms of a case A and a case B. Let's use Afghanistan. Case A for Afghanistan would be, in the fall of 2001, we had one political objective, which was to overthrow the interlocking directorate of the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and which constituted, as Jim said years ago, if the attack of 9/11 didn't constitute just cause, the concept of just cause is meaningless, which I think you said that. And case B, though, would be going into Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 with multiple political objectives. First, to overthrow the interlocking directorate of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Second, to help the Afghans develop themselves into a functioning civil society at home. And third, help the Afghans develop themselves into a society that would be a responsible member of the international community. So what makes, to me, these two conflicts, Iraq and Afghanistan, so protracted is that case A was not the situation. It was case B, where we had three political objectives, and you had a whole lot more work to do in both cases after you overthrew the existing regime. So let me talk about how some of these factors could be worked into the decision to go to war. And here, too, I see a parallel between strategy and ethics. Someone earlier today already cited B.H. Liddell Hart, who said the object in war is a better state of peace. Many of the just war tradition authors write about the ultimate goal of war is a better state of peace. In the Afghan case A, where we only had a single political objective, the better state is no Taliban and al-Qaeda running Afghanistan, period, full stop. In terms of military strategy, that meant you overthrow the existing regime, which quite frankly was not all that difficult to do. As my friend General Jim Mattis once said, you know, these are the guys who spent the last 10 years slapping women around. They're not exactly a formidable foe militarily for an organized, disciplined armed force. In just war terms, you would say, well, we had just cause. They attacked us. Probability of success was very high. A very weak enemy, formidable, organized, disciplined, well-equipped armed forces. Probability of success was very good, and that we could likely accomplish much more good than harm we would cause. Afghan case B looks quite different, though. There, the better state of peace is, one, no Taliban al-Qaeda running Afghanistan, two, a functioning civil society at home, and three, a society that is a responsible member of the international community. On the strategy level, that means you're thinking not just about military strategy, but about grand strategy, which Liddell Hart again says, whereas military strategy is only concerned with the problem of winning military victory, the problem, grand strategy must take the longer view, for its problem is the winning of the peace. In U.S. government terms, that gets us into what we call whole of government. It's not just the uniform military. It's the State Department, it's AID, it's the Department of Justice, the Department of Agriculture. It's a much more comprehensive and complex challenge to do that. The role of grand strategy, Hart says, Liddell Hart says, is to coordinate and direct all the resources of a nation towards attainment of the political objective of the war. That then, in strategic terms, leads us to ask questions about feasibility. How feasible is it to transform this society into a functioning civil society at home that will be a responsible member of the international community? The probability of success of that, given a highly fragmented, highly factionalized, highly illiterate, terribly poor population. There was a quote in one of the newspapers from a Dutch general who described being in Afghanistan as a walk through the Old Testament. And so what is the probability of success of doing all three of those political objectives in a case like this? What is the proportionality? What are the chances of doing more good than harm in trying to do so? So it seems to me that these kinds of considerations would have been better thought of in the use ad bellum phase rather than waiting until after the fighting is over and then thinking about some of these challenges to do. It's almost impossible to do all of that if there are profound and wide differences of opinion between the outsiders and the locals over what principles are going to guide the stabilization, reconstruction, and nation building of Iraq, the treatment of women, education systems, political system. As hard as it is to do if the outsiders could impose their will, if part of the objective is the return of sovereignty, it becomes much more complex when there are profound, wide differences of opinion among not only amongst the outsiders, but between many of the outsiders and many of the locals. Third, let me turn now briefly to talk about the conduct of war. And here too, Liddell Hart is not myopically short-termed or narrowly military. He says it is essential to conduct war with constant regard to the peace you desire. So he doesn't isolate tactical things from the larger strategic realities. In just war terms, we talk about discrimination and proportionality. Afghan case A, only overthrow the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Military strategy, again, very straightforward. And discrimination and proportionality, as reflected in the law of war, law of armed conflict, provide very good, useful, practical guidance for the conduct of military operations if all you're going to do is overthrow the interlocking directorate of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Just war tradition, again, the calculations of discrimination and proportionality are quite easy to do, consistent with the law of war, including military necessity. But if you turn to Afghan case B, overthrow Taliban and al-Qaeda, functioning civil society, responsible member of international community, then your military strategy becomes counterinsurgency over the long haul, after you've overthrown the regime. And that is a much more complex, much more difficult problem, in part because the objective is really the loyalties, in Vietnam terms we said hearts and minds, we might say trust and confidence of a local population. And that translates into military operations that are much more complex to do. The writing of the counterinsurgency field manual was a major intellectual, in military terms, doctrinal step forward. But the challenge is to have that permeate down to the operational level, to units themselves. And we had a learning curve, and we're getting better at it, but we still have a long way to go. It seems to me that if you're thinking about the Afghan case B, in just war terms, if you think about discrimination and proportionality, you probably have the same standard for discrimination. A combatant is a combatant, a non-combatant is a non-combatant. It may be hard to tell which ones are which, but the intentionality part is fairly straightforward. It does seem to me, though, that if the objective is the loyalty, the trust and confidence of a certain population, then perhaps in the conduct of military operations in a protracted war, we might want to think about a higher standard of proportionality in terms of collateral damage, unintentional harm to non-combatants. Because again, they are the object of what all of this is about. And every non-combatant that we kill or harm who doesn't deserve any of that has siblings, aunts, uncles, parents, cousins, fellow tribesmen, fellow villagers who are part of that population that we are trying to win over to the larger cause. So therefore, unintentional harm to non-combatants that might be acceptable in case A might not be acceptable in case B. I think it forces strategists, ethicists, and military commanders to rethink how we approach the concept of proportionality. My sense is it probably means that we ought to raise the bar for proportionality calculations, given political objectives 2 and 3. So in conclusion, let me just say, in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't mean to generalize to all wars, but I spend most of my working life thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan. In conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, it seems to me the concept of postbellum that replaces in bello is just not helpful. And therefore, I would argue that much of the content of the postbellum literature ought to be folded into our very early on thinking about ad bellum analyses, calculations, and decisions, and folded into, during these protracted military operations, our analyses, calculations, and decisions about in bello issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pierce. And now Professor Oren.
Great. I too want to thank the organizers, especially Eric, for the invitation and the terrific job. And it's great to be here. Great to meet people I've always wanted to meet, and great to meet old friends again. So my topic is towards a new Geneva Convention. So unlike others who've said some things this morning, I'm a fan of Postbellum. Although I appreciate, comments about the need to avoid hubris and how there can be no sharp distinction between in bello and postbellum. One of the great metaphors I've heard in this regard is there should be one bright red normative thread run through each of the phases of war, right? So beginning, middle, and end. It all has to kind of come together in a coherent bundle. So I would endorse that. At the same time, I think that the status quo is kind of unacceptable and has various cons to it that would be remedied by a brand new Geneva Convention focused exclusively on the issue of use post-bellum. The sub-theme of this panel is issue for practitioners, right? And practitioners, I think, as we've all met them, some of us are them or were them, I think have more respect for the law than they do just for ethics. They think ethics is a lot more malleable. And so I think it would be terrific to focus the mind of decision makers to have a brand new Geneva Convention focused on use post-bellum. So I guess that's one reason. Focus, bring focus to the minds of decision makers about the importance of these sorts of issues. The second reason why we should have a new Geneva Convention is we need it to complete the laws of war. As we all know, the start of war gets a lot of regulation. There's a lot of rules, the UN Charter, Hague Convention. And then the middle part of war has perhaps the most regulation of all, right? Hague Conventions, Geneva Conventions, a whole bunch of particular treaties. And the post-war scenario has clearly almost no regulation to it. There are a bit, right? Robert Williams mentioned occupation law. There are, of course, all the war crimes trial legislation. But by and large, it's fair to say that postbellum is largely unregulated. And my own view as to why this is the case is the common belief that to the winner go the spoils of war, right? And winners don't want any kind of restraint on their conduct after they've won a war. In fact, I was at The Hague a couple years ago making a similar plea for a new Geneva Convention, and to a bunch of international lawyers, and I kid you not, they all burst out laughing. Now, we all give talks and lectures, right? And we all know it's one thing when people are laughing with you, and it's quite another when people are laughing at you, especially when they're a bunch of lawyers, right?
Fill in the blanks.
You weren't laughing.
So, and of course, their notion was, well, there's no way winners of war are ever going to accept restraints on their conduct. They've kind of won a war right to impose whatever terms of the peace that they want. Two responses to that. One, well, restraining the winners is kind of an important thing to do in the post-war moment because winners have been known to exact draconian, harmful terms of the peace, right? The classic example being the Treaty of Versailles, right? So we need to restrain the winners, okay? So, from the fact that winners may not like it, doesn't negate the fact that they need to be restrained. Secondly, I'm actually not so sure that winners can't benefit from there being clear public rules that govern their post-war conduct. For example, right, Al was talking great stuff about Afghanistan and Iraq. Don't you think the Americans would actually love it if they could point to an international treaty and point to their various obligations and say, look, we have satisfied these, we are out of here? right? So I think even the winners, right? Clearly the losers of a war can benefit from postbellum rules, right? They'll be restrained from a vengeful, draconian winner. But even the winners can benefit from there being clear, practical rules that guide everyone's expectations and provide people with assurances, right? Because in my view, unregulated war endings prolong the fighting, right? Because people lack assurances about how it's going to go down. So why not keep using force to jockey for position? Because maybe the military tide will turn, right? I think this was clearly the case in Bosnia, where there were peace negotiations almost from the very outbreak of the war. And yet the fighting continued for 3 years, right? As a series of peace negotiations happened, right? So having clear, firm, set rules, right? I think is of benefit to everyone. And then finally, a point that has been made many times today. We know that when wars are wrapped up badly, they sow the seeds of future wars, right? The connection between the two world wars, the connection between the two Serb wars, right, in the middle 90s, and then the connection between the two Iraq wars, right? So if we can advance debate about what constitutes a proper post-war scenario, this may help to prevent future wars. Now, I already can hear the objections in your mind, right? So I'm going to try to anticipate them and respond to them, right? For example, one cynical old woman in France said to me one time, she said, "Look, what do you mean? A new Geneva Convention? The existing ones don't get to adhere to anyway." And then she took a drag on a cigarette, right? Like, wow, that's pessimistic. This is a ridiculous response. No, right? The existence of lawbreakers doesn't negate the point of the law, right? Or of trying to correct behavior. So from the fact that people, you know, steal doesn't mean we should get rid of laws against theft, right? So that's my response to that. The second critical challenge that I could anticipate was people will say, well, we'll never get agreement about something like that. It's so difficult. There's such various scenarios, right? We'll never come to agreement, right? But look, we've come to agreement on ad bellum stuff, in bello stuff, very complex issues. Also, with international law, we've come to agreement on trade deals, very specific, technical, complex. We've even come up with agreements on human rights treaties, and I kind of totally echo what Professor Williams was saying this morning in that regard. And so why should we think? Why should we just give in to the skeptics that, you know, it can't be done, and let's just kind of wash our hands of it? And then the other response that I want to say, well, how are you going to enforce such a new Geneva Convention? Well, that challenge could be leveled at any new piece of international law, right? This is a technical issue. Maybe new institutions have to be created. Maybe there's issues of practicality and bureaucracy, right? So the proposal of a new Geneva Convention doesn't run afoul of that. Now, okay, so that's the need for a new Geneva Convention. What should be the principles that might inspire such a convention, right? I think there's two common kind of ideal types, and I stress that they're ideal types, right? And you know, I know this. And these types assume that there has been a winner, and I appreciate comments to the fact that often, sometimes there's not, right? Like the Iran-Iraq war, you know, they just stopped fighting because they realized no one could win. But in the case where there are kind of winners and losers, two kind of ideal models or types tend to dominate thinking about post-war justice, right? And what's the general picture of a Geneva Convention? And that's the model of revenge versus the model of rehabilitation, all right? So here's how I would kind of sketch out the general principles or commitments of each of these models. So first, the revenge model. There needs to be public peace treaties. There needs to be an apology from the aggressor. There needs to be war crimes trials for those who are responsible. You need to exchange prisoners of war at the end. The aggressor has to give up any gains that he gained during the war. Some demilitarization is required, so there's no repeat of the aggression that started the war. But then, and this is what makes it a revenge model, the aggressor has to suffer further losses beyond that, right? As an instance of revenge or punishment. Now, which further losses? Almost always historically, we're talking forms of reparations, right? Reparations payments to victimized societies, and then continuing sanctions to hamper the economic growth of that society moving forward. And then the revenge model says, that's it, get out. There's no responsibility for reconstruction. That's too risky, that's too costly. Leave it to the locals and leave. And two recent examples of this, as I'm sure we all know, right, the Treaty of Versailles, and I would even argue the ending of the first Iraq War as well, as a classic model of revenge. Now, in my view, revenge is a bad policy. Why? One, I think history shows it creates future wars, creates new generations of enemies. Vengeful policies, especially sanctions, often hurt civilians and thus violate discrimination. In my view, justice doesn't demand revenge, right? Why not forget, forgive, reconstruct, move on? And finally, revenge doesn't deal with the structural problems of the continuing existence of the bad regime. Right? So I think revenge model is bad, but I'm actually worried about it, right? Because I think that the rehabilitation model as being applied in Iraq and Afghanistan is proving so difficult and costly that I fear there's going to be a pendulum swing away from rehabilitation back toward the old revenge model, right, with the ending of the next big war. So I'm very fearful for that, and I want to prevent that from happening. So I want to endorse the rehabilitation model. And let me just talk quickly about that. First of all, there's no strict dichotomy between the revenge and the rehabilitation model. There is an overlapping consensus, right? A Rawlsian overlapping consensus, which consists of the following. Public peace treaty, apologies, exchange prisoners of war, trials for criminals, aggressor has to give up aggressive gains, and there needs to be some demilitarization. But the difference between the two models is on three big things. One, sanctions. Defenders of the rehabilitative model essentially say no way, because this history shows that this harms civilians in a disproportionate way. And Iraq was a terrible example of this, right? Terrible yet accurate. Okay, so one big difference is on sanctions. Second issue has to do with reparations or compensation to the victimized society. Rehabilitators say no way, right? You ought not to force the defeated aggressor to give a ton of resources to a defeated victim, because that, reconstruction and rehabilitation is difficult enough. Try doing it while you're sucking resources out of that society, right? And then history, right, the fact that history has shown what it has shown with the revenge model should come as no surprise. It just creates chaos. And then the third thing that they differ on is regime change, right? So the revenge model says, no way, too risky, too costly, not our responsibility, right? Our responsibility was to defeat the aggressor. Whereas the rehabilitators say, no, this can be worth it over the long term, right? And of course, the great historical examples that they would point to would be the reconstruction of West Germany and Japan following the Second World War. Okay, so, what should be, these are the two models that could inform a new Geneva Convention. What do I think should be the guiding principles, right? So I've already said I'm a rehabilitator. I think we have to distinguish between the goals and the means when we talk about reconstruction. What's the goal or the point of reconstruction or rehabilitation, and what are the means to achieve it? So in my view, the overall goal of rehabilitation or reconstruction should not be a Western society, right? But what I call a minimally just society, and I was thrilled to hear James Turner Johnson use that term in a positive way this morning, right? How I would define a minimally just society is that it satisfies three things. First, obviously, it's peaceful and non-aggressive, right? At the very least, right? At the end of war, it has to be non-aggressive. Second, it has a newly legitimate political structure, right? Legitimacy recognized both domestically and internationally. I mean, I realize that's a complex question. I think legitimacy can be shown in different ways, right? Although I should point out, I think democratic elections are the most practical way. And I don't say that, trying to be like a Western liberal Democrat bigot or something like this, showing excessive hubris. I just think that's just good, practical, right? Hard to deny your legitimate regime if you've won multiple free and fair, regular public elections, right, with one person, one vote. And then thirdly, and I again endorse Dr. Williams's things this morning, a minimally just society tries its best to satisfy the human rights of its people. And by human rights, essentially, just to give you a sense, I have a minimal view of human rights, obviously to keep costs down and just to be reasonable. So I think things like basic personal security, material subsistence, individual freedom, what I call elemental equality and social recognition as a person. I think these are the 5 things that human rights are most centrally designed to protect, so that everyone can have a minimally decent life. Okay. The goal should be a minimally just society that satisfies those 3 principles. What are the means or the process to achieving those goals? And here there's a lot of overlap between what Al was saying and what I was saying, kind of folding together the in bello and the post-bellum. I get these 10 things from Jim Dobbins' great work on post-war reconstruction. He's got 2 books, one on American involvement in post-war reconstruction and the other on the UN's involvement in post-war reconstruction, right? So using his work, I've come up with what I call, tongue-in-cheek, a 10-step recipe. I'm inspired by Julia Child, right? To cook a minimally just society in a fragile post-war scenario. So I'm just going to quickly run through them. They're all enormously controversial, right? But just to give you a kind of sense of my practical focus. First, oh, is that total time? Yeah, okay. All right, can I just conclude?
Yes.
Sorry, okay, sorry, not to take, all right, so I have a 10-step recipe, and then what I was gonna say is the following. History shows that successful post-war reconstruction has been done. Therefore, logically, it can be done. Will it be done in Iraq and Afghanistan? Myself, I doubt it, and in my paper I give 5 reasons why probably not, unfortunately. Right? It's a difficult business, and the only thing I want to submit in advance today is that trying to structure a treaty, a new Geneva Convention about post-war justice would advance the purposes of that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Arendt and Professor Elshtain.
Thank you very much. I'm the cleanup batter, which means I probably won't say anything that hasn't already been said today, but let me see if I can perhaps add a twist or two or tweak things in certain ways that might offer up some other angles of vision. My emphasis in the paper that is yet to be written, this is a kind of prolegomenon that I'll be working with. I'm talking about an ethics of responsibility, and I want to indicate something about what that entails. Well, first of all, the ethics of responsibility is built up on the ground of the post-World War II recognition of the universality of human rights, shared revulsion at genocide, and the relatively recently articulated norm of a responsibility to protect that I'm sure you've heard about. This responsibility to protect ideal, which was issued, there was a commission that came up with this, issued under the aegis of the United Nations, holds that should a nation or group of nations be the victim of systematic, egregious, and continuing violence, the formulation is mine, but that's really the direction the report goes. The international community, under those circumstances, has a responsibility to do something about that situation. If the United Nations does not act, it's paralyzed and refuses to act, it follows that a member state of the UN or group of states may, given a widely shared consensus on the nature of the horrors being perpetrated, may act legitimately to interdict the violence and to contain the horror. Now, because it is always a good bet that the United Nations will, in fact, be incapable of mounting a serious military commitment, and because our European allies are usually prepared to do very little by way of military intervention, even in situations where they have a historic stake, for example, the French in Rwanda, it follows that the United States, just by default, if for no other reason, given that it is the state with more power to project its power than any other, may be called upon or call upon itself to act in these circumstances. Be that as it may, this underlying norm of responsibility with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Genocide Convention, and so on as its backdrop, is one feature of an overall ethics of responsibility. That is, it's part of the context within which this ethics of responsibility gets framed. Now, to this, we need to add, of course, the just war tradition, which very much has to do precisely with the question of responsibility. This tradition also, as you know, tells us something about the goals or ends of war and how these might bear on an ethics of responsibility and what we might call an ethics of exit. You've heard already today that the end of a war must be related intrinsically to the initial argument for the conflict as couched in just war criteria, namely to repair or to remedy a major injustice or act of aggression, to punish aggressors. Another just cause might be to prevent nigh certain and massive harm from occurring before it has occurred, although this is a controversial claim with just war thinkers divided on the question of preemptive or preventive wars. But the issue of humanitarian intervention sort of pushes us to consider these possibilities. If we have almost sure and certain knowledge of impending massacres, do we wait for those to occur, or do we act before they occur? All agree that the goal of the justified use of force is a more just situation than the one that pertained before the armed conflict. Now, in the classical theological accounts that inaugurated the just war tradition in the West, you heard this from Jim Johnson earlier today, this more ideal state of things is called a tranquility of order. We might call it a kind of decent civic peace. And a determining criterion for making a decision for the use of armed force is a prudential one. Do you stand a good chance of success? You're not permitted to make a bad situation worse, or at least you're obliged to do everything you can to prevent that sort of unhappy outcome, again, as part of the responsibility you bear. Now, given this rough and ready framework of evaluation, what does, let's call it an ethics of exit, require if one adheres to just war norms and the responsibility to protect? And I was thinking of all of this, as you might suspect, with the Iraq War in mind. Now, here's some criteria I think that are consistent with just war and an ethics of just occupation and exit. Again, as central features of this wider notion of an ethics of responsibility. And here, what I have to say, I think overlaps with what we heard of Mark Evans' paper this morning. First, a country that has committed to major military operations must assess its degree of responsibility for the post-war situation. If its role was minor, its responsibility is correlatively diminished. Certainly a major power, one who has undertaken major responsibility, should bring as many on board as possible when it commits to war, particularly, again, what we know of UN ineptitude, where the brutalities of dictatorial regimes and the endemic horrors of failed states are concerned. Waiting for the UN in many of these circumstances, as you know, is rather more frustrating than waiting for Godot. Second, a country that's engaged in military operations, major military operations, or has engaged in them, bears a burden in repairing infrastructural and environmental harm that is the direct result of military operations. That is to say, suppose certain basic necessities of life have been disrupted, water and electricity, this has to be tended to. Then attention can be paid to schools, to hospitals, to other basic institutions of any minimally decent civic order. Third, repair of the political infrastructure is made necessary if the whole point of a just war is a just peace. Again, this means leaving the people in the country that was the site of conflict, as well as the wider international environment, in better shape than before the intervention. So there's a very delicate balancing act involved here, as one labors to restore authority, only this time legitimate authority. The worst possible outcome, obviously, is a scenario reminiscent of Chapter 13 of Hobbes's classic Leviathan. Now, in all of this, the international community has a huge stake in the outcome and should play a helpful and not a blocking or undermining role. We know that failed states, and the worst possible scenario of an intervention would be a failed state left in the aftermath. They pose as much of a threat to international peace as do rogue states. Fourth, continued provision of defense and security. If a country has been disarmed, the occupying power has taken on, at least for a time, responsibility for its security and its protection from external and internal enemies. How long this provision will be, how extensive, will depend on threat assessment and the rapidity with which the country occupied rebuilds its own defense and internal security capability. Finally, a major interest and responsibility, should any future horror, like the emergence, for example, in Iraq of yet another Saddam-type Republic of Fear, should that, to forestall that from happening, one has to think about the question of deterrence. Let me explain. The complexity is that deterrence necessarily bears both an internal as well as an external aspect, as one reflects on use post-bellum. Even as the United States, as you've heard a couple of times, protected Western Europe, including a new German democratic state throughout the Cold War and the decades of bipolarity, so the United States, as one feature of exiting ethically, will remain tied to the new Iraq in ways that are thick, certainly for some time to come. That is, just as the Allies would never have permitted a Nazi state to reemerge in Germany, so we have a responsibility, should internal forces of stability and decency falter and collapse, to do the same in Iraq, lest the Iraqi people be victimized many times over. Similarly, you've heard it mentioned today, there's no chance, it seems to me, if we can do anything to prevent it, that we would permit the reemergence of a victorious Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. Now, I suspect that if such use post-bellum criteria are debated and considered explicitly as part of an overall set of issues attendant upon a decision to use armed force in the first place, that it would add much to the gravamen of the situation. And that's entirely appropriate, it seems to me, from an ethical point of view. Now, if the Bush administration was correct, and I think it was, that 9/11 and the terrorist attacks of the 1990s underscored the fact that we were in a new strategic environment, it followed and follows that our thinking about matters of war and peace must take account of that new environment. That is, throughout the years of the Cold War, there were many just causes that could not be addressed, could not be pursued militarily. For example, open intervention in behalf of the Hungarian freedom fighters in 1956. There are a few of us in the room old enough maybe to remember that, because of the terrible dangers of a nuclear exchange, escalation, and a nuclear exchange between the superpowers. During this era, the United States made its peace with many unsavory regimes in the interest of deterring Soviet revisionism. We're no longer in that particular world. So many of the old constraints are off. And I think we're in the process of building up new constraints, thinking of what those might be in this new situation, new constraints and new possibilities. Many of these constraints will be constraints we place upon ourselves, given that we don't face, at least at this point, a major foe. We don't have that clear world of bipolarity that we had for so many years. So it's altogether a good thing that we have available to us a tradition of restraint, even in a just cause. And the use post-bellum that we're talking about is a continuation of that tradition of restraint. Now, at the same time, restraint does not mean paralysis. It does not mean inaction. It does not mean moral condemnation only. There's an active dimension. And I think the elaboration and articulation of this ethics of responsibility points to the fact that condemnation alone does not suffice. Now, there are many, of course, who, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, have lamented the sort of chaos that seemed to ensue, or the uncertainty, let me put it that way. Chaos is too strong a word, because it sounded as if traditional restraints on the use of armed force had been abandoned or were now gone. But that doesn't seem to me to be the case. Certainly, so long as our discussions of these matters take place in and through the categories of the just war tradition, then embedded restraints are undeniable. They're there, and we need to ongoingly think through them and with them. So where elaboration seems necessary, hence the whole point of this conference, is in this use post-bellum phase of the conflict, in part because so many of our images of post-war and post-occupation situations are by now somewhat archaic. This has been referred to so many times, but you know, the notion at one point that the purpose of war is the restoration of the status quo ante. You know, that's what we're seeking. But that's not, for the most part, what contemporary use post-bellum is about, if the conflict was one aimed at overthrowing a dangerous and oppressive tyranny. Perhaps borders remain the same, but not very much else will. Now, the model with which we're most familiar in this sort of circumstance are the models of the occupations that you've also heard about of Germany and Japan after World War II. The German occupation being marred by the fact that a tyranny responsible for the deaths of at least as many people as Hitler's Germany was a party to it. Difficult to speak of a just occupation overall in that situation. On the Western side, of course, the aim was a stable, democratic German regime and state, and that, in fact, was achieved. In Japan, something was done that would now be unthinkable, namely a group of Westerners, of Americans, writing a constitution for a conquered state and putting it in place, and the whole thing sort of working out. At this point, that would be considered an act of unbridled hubris, and we would question the legitimacy of such a regime. So we need am I at my 2-minute? I am, all right, well, I'm good because I'm almost there. I mean, good that I have 2 more minutes. So we need pardon?
You already had your 2-minute warning.
Okay, all right. So we need a third model, one that looks to the creation of, I'm using the language of minimally decent, minimally just. I think we're all talking about something similar. Stable societies that rely ideally on certain processes of democracy to achieve that end of minimal decency. I refer, of course, to elections, representative assemblies, consultative coalition, constitution writing, and all the rest. Brian is right. This process is fraught with difficulty. It's very cumbersome. It virtually guarantees a period of uncertainty and instability, but the outcome will be one, if things work out, that vests a new government with legitimacy it would otherwise lack, particularly in conflicts involving countries with distinct and striking cultural histories and differences. I think that I am probably at the end here, but let me say one final thing about Iraq, and that is that how this all works out over the long run, the process, the continuing process of standing down from our military engagement with Iraq, this can never be divorced from serious ethical consideration. It is undeniably the case that whatever we do and how we do it, that outcome is going to be viewed by peoples of the Middle East from this point on for some time to come as a political and ethical benchmark of what U.S. intervention and occupation look like. The tragedy was our failure to provide the necessaries for a stable post-major military conflict security environment. Very harsh lesson has been learned there, I hope. But if we move too hastily, and if we have impatience with continuing our engagement then that too could cast a pall over American foreign policy for decades to come. And there would be nothing particularly ethical about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elstein. We're going to open it up for questions now. We have about 20 minutes. If we go to 2 o'clock, if we go a little bit over, I don't think that's a problem. What I'd like you to do is please stand up when the microphone, and when I point to you and we'll give you a microphone, please say your name and organization that you represent, and please frame your statements in the form of a question.
Hi, George Lucas from the Naval Academy, and thank you, panel. It was a wonderful presentation by all of you. My question is primarily to Brian Oren, but I think others may want to comment on it. I'm trying to decide whether your proposed new Geneva Conventions, while they would clearly be governance, would they be good governance? Jim Johnson was opposed to a governance or legalistic conception and principle of use post-bellum, thought that might not work for a variety of reasons. Robert Royal complained it might over-engineer the attempts at trying to establish a just peace, that it would take on more than we're capable of. My own concern is that it sounded to me like your proposals really presupposed a kind of conventional arrangement, conventional war, that they really didn't address, as I think your own post-bellum proposals do address, the irregular war situation that Al Pierce was talking about, and the oscillation between conflict and in bello and post-bellum that doesn't really neatly divide out in the way that conceptually you might wish if you tried to legislate it. So I wondered if you could respond to those questions.
Sure. Thanks, George. Yeah, so I guess I'm just trying to defend the utility of having a new Geneva Convention devoted to such principles, and that kind of, that takes a while to do, and how come this is generally a good idea, and it's to fill in a gap, and this gap is kind of harmful. But I certainly don't pretend to have a fully articulate, complete notion of post-war justice that can apply to both conventional and irregular situations, right? I just view my task as contributing to that discussion, right? So, and I'm philosophically trained, so I'm going to talk about, ideal types and the possibility for consensus between them. I guess I do kind of have governance-related aspirations with the principles. But obviously, the local population has to be robustly involved and give their consent for this to work. But I do think, there is such a thing as a minimally just society, and there are societies that fail to meet those principles, and it's not as though we have to show too much deference or respect to the continuation of such institutions. I mean, it's incumbent upon us to explain the rationale and the justification for the sorts of values and principles that we're trying to put in. But I think just to advance the debate, there needs to be substantive principles like that put on the table, right? Without anyone kind of pretending that, they've got it all, right? I mean, look, a helpful analogy is to kind of the law in everyday life, right? There's general legal principles, and then when an issue goes to court, right, then this is where you deal with all the empirical complexities of the given situation, right? What did that person actually do? What do witnesses see, right? And so I see no inconsistency in kind of defending general principles and saying they can still be helpful to help guide the actors in very complex local conflicts, whether those conflicts are conventional or irregular.
If I could leap in here for just a moment. I'm one of those who's also a bit suspicious of casting certain essentially political questions in terms that are perhaps more legalistic than political. I certainly think there's a tension here in this room and with the speakers and in the discussion more generally, not necessarily people at loggerheads at every point, but some tension between those who, let's say, come from a more sort of neo-Kantian perspective and those that see themselves as being perhaps rather more immersed in concrete political considerations and viewing the just war tradition, and I think Michael Walzer is correct, as a casuistical tradition, as emerging out of the tradition of casuistry and out of the concerns of statescraft, initially Christian statescraft. You know, how should we act in office, given that the world is not perfect and all kinds of bad things happen in it? So how are we to behave? How are we to act? How can one reason from certain principles and norms, and knowing that those principles and norms are going to come under tremendous pressure, may at times have to be overridden, and so on. I think that's a rather different way of approaching it than to cast, you know, principles in a more legal sense. There's also, of course, always with efforts of that type, a sort of serpent in the garden, which is enforcement. You know, who's charged with enforcement here? Who's charged with seeing that these principles are abided by? What on earth would be the incentive to abide by them? In any case, if it proved to be enormously costly for a country that was in a particular situation dealing with a post-war or post-conflict situation. I think also that we need to be a little bit cautious about pushing too thoroughly the kind of domestic law, international arena analogy, because the kind of thickness of domestic law and enforcement and the legitimacy of the system in and through which that's enforced is really not replicable in the international arena in the same way, which doesn't mean the international arena is lawless. And there are some analogies one can push, but it is a fundamentally different kind of world that one enters there.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mona Kennedy. I'm from IPOA, the Association of the Stability Operations Industry. And my question is, I feel that whether we like it or hate it, the private military contractors are a primordial component of the modern warfare. They're here during the war and in the post-war stages and strategies. So I'm curious to hear from the speakers how they feel that private military contractors would fit within the just war theory, within the international law of war, knowing, taking into considerations that these same contractors are working on a code of conduct for themselves that is based on their own lessons learned and on the international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a couple points. While I agree with you that contractors are here to stay, I don't mean by that they're here to stay in the size, numbers, way, shape, and form that they are right now. I mean, quite frankly, I have no problem with contractors peeling potatoes to feed the troops. I have a lot more problems when contractors are doing things that look like traditional military functions, particularly when that involves the use of deadly force. And we're having a larger debate in the government now about what is an inherently governmental function, and we've lost sight of that concept, and I think we need to get that back. Whether that's on military operations or, quite frankly, intelligence collection or analysis. Now, I'm a government employee, so I got a stake in this, but I think there are some inherently governmental functions that ought to be performed by people who are full-time employees of the U.S. government. The second comment of the two I'll make is, in the Defense Department, we've had for many, many years a slogan, one team, one fight, and that's sort of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps get together. It's a much more complex problem than that, because we've talked ourselves into a situation where we have three kinds of people: active duty military, employees of other government agencies, and private contractors doing virtually identical work. So my new mantra is one team, one fight, one set of rules. And that we ought not to have, if we have three groups of people doing essentially similar work, there should not be three or even two sets of rules for them. Everybody ought to be bound by the same set of rules, because ultimately they're all there on behalf of the American people and paid for by taxpayer funds. End of my riff.
Thank you. Well said.
I'm sorry, before you ask your question, could I just, no one asked a question about this, but can I make a comment about David's paper? It could bring tears to your eyes. I mean, it was quite beautiful to listen to and to think about the kinds of men who were involved at the top in fighting, leading the fight in the Civil War and so on. But I was haunted as I listened, I have to say, by Lincoln's second inaugural. You know, we all pray to the same God, we read the same Bible, and so on. I think under those circumstances, you're far more likely to see that kind of possibility emerge than in situations where you've got very different cultures and understandings and so forth. And let me just mention that I had the great opportunity in 1994 to have a conversation with Bishop Tutu, and a group of us did. And one of the things that he said, and this was seconded by other members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission present on that occasion, was that the reason that it worked, or worked as well as it did, was the fact that the overwhelming majority of Black South Africans were Christians. So you had available to you this thick, deep language of forgiveness and reconciliation. And if you don't have the same ready access to that, I don't think that one can necessarily hope for a similar outcome. It doesn't mean there has to be just murderous assault, but we have to really keep in mind what the conceptual repertoire is that's available to people in a given situation, what their traditions are, what makes some sense to them, what we can tap. And I think that's one of the things that haunts us when we hear, the kind of story that David told so well.
Can I just add one quick comment? I mean, I agree with you completely that having some common reservoir to tap into is a huge advantage over not having one. At the same time, having a common reservoir is no guarantee.
No, I know.
If you look at Sunni-Shia violence,
Right.
that's not a
common.
guarantee.
Yeah.
Professor Elstein, and this is a challenge to the professor. You said how the world changed after 9/11, and so much of what we do today is justified by 9/11. Indeed, that's how we hear it on the media every day. Yet, we cannot find a single government official to publicly defend their position on 9/11, and we cannot find any academic to defend the position on 9/11. There are a recent Angus Reid poll in the last month said 26% of Americans do not believe the official position. There are over 1,000 registered architects, engineers that do not believe the official position.
And the question is?
Yes. The question is, are you prepared to defend your position on 9/11, which is, I presume, is the official position, in a public forum? I would be happy to challenge you and to debate you on that subject. And the same goes for any government official or any other academic that wishes to defend that position.
Well, I assume by the official position you mean, do I concur that the evidence is absolutely overwhelming about the nature of the attacks and who carried them out. And of course I'd be prepared to defend that, as I think pretty much any sensible, rational person would. The fact that 26% of the public doesn't believe this just tells us how widespread irrational conspiracy theories can be, and is not a compelling argument for anything. On the issue of what I was saying about 9/11 had nothing to do per se with the attacks, but the fact that, with the nature of the attacks, but rather that we are in a new security environment with the end of the Cold War, which is what I was emphasizing, and the recognition with 9/11 that our primary opponents are likely not to be states so much often as sub-state entities, non-state entities, and you've heard a lot about that in the discussion today, about irregular warfare, asymmetrical warfare. It's put in a variety of different ways. So I wasn't justifying anything given 9/11, but just alerting us to the fact that I think those who made the argument that we're in a different security environment now, a different strategic environment, that in fact is entirely correct. And let me just quickly defend my fellow symposius, if not myself, against the notion of white man's burden. I don't think this has anything to do with race or colonialism or imperialism. In fact, the whole burden today was people being extremely cautious about any such suggestion. And, and even in my remarks, I said, the kind of thing that happened after World War II would be unthinkable now with us, writing a constitution for Japan, that we're just in a different world in that regard. So I really don't think it's a reasonable charge to speak of white man's burden in this context today.
Okay.
Well,
We have time for one more question. Dr. Love?
It may sound a little odd coming after the previous question, but I spend a lot of my time working with the Catholic Peace Building Network and working with folks who work on the ground in conflicts around the world. And throughout today's discussions, I've been thinking this conversation would go a lot differently if my friends who are priests and folks in Africa were part of this conversation, not on the question of white man's burden, but on the question of where you are relevant to the conflict and the fact of non-state actors. So I guess it's just a general concern, not of hubris so much, but of looking at it through American eyes, and especially, as Al said, we spend all our time looking at Iraq and Afghanistan. Understandably, we have to. These are imperatives for our culture right now. But that coming up with general guidelines or moral guidelines can look very different when you're talking about civil war in Africa. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it. I think the moral imperative is more important to do it when the conflict is more unjust. But that we need to challenge our where we come from. And I understand, Eric, you can't invite people from Africa. Your budget doesn't extend that far. But it does make it more difficult because the nature of conflict is not at all uniform, and it's going to look very different. And one way around that is perhaps thinking about participation rather than perhaps democratic governance as we would look at in the United States. Another way around it might be looking at traditional forms of organization that might be more appropriate in different cultural venues than the forms of organization we're more familiar with. So just think about the categories that you proposed to us today, which I think are very valuable to widen the discussion, and maybe think about them in other cultural venues, how well they would work, how you would communicate them perhaps differently, even if you're trying to say some of the same normative concerns.
Thank you. I just want to resist, though, the notion that it would look completely differently, because surely if you're speaking about basic human dignity, basic human rights, protection of vulnerable peoples, that doesn't require any translation. I mean, those are things that are immediately available to people on the ground. And those of us who have some contact with folks who are on the ground dealing with these things, there's a shared language of concern. So I would resist pushing us in a direction that would suggest there are sort of entirely different epistemological universes inhabited on the one hand by those who are on the ground dealing with these issues, on the other hand, people who do panels like this and reflect on these issues. I don't think that's the case, and I believe that if we had some of those practitioners here with us today, that they would share the concerns and much of the language that you heard today. They would talk about their own activities and how those work out on the ground. But I heard a lot of concern today about the actual effect on the ground of what we do and how we do it, and impact on people locally of what we do and how we do it. So I think those are shared concerns and issues.
Professor Crocker, we'll give you the last word.
I just wanted to say I'd already given a title of experience from the Americas, but I could easily have dealt with Nelson Mandela and the TRC and the symbolic role that he played in negotiations with Botha, with de Klerk, and then if you've seen the movie Invictus, you know the role that he played symbolically in bringing together two communities that had been not only fearful but in hatred of each other. So I think we do have some wonderful African success stories, but also some failures as well.
Okay, let's give a warm round of applause for our panelists.